Intense last 6 presentations, very intense, you'll agree. Everyone very, very intense and really keen on conveying their learning and their experience. Yeah. Morning, we had a lot of inspiring people who set up centers, a lot of passion, a lot of emotion, and I'm sure each one of those presentations were very touching in the way they brought about the individual circumstances, and they really put that across extremely well. I'm sure everyone found that emotional connect. After this afternoon, all these 6 talks, what I found common was by very passionate professionals, very describing and defending, if I can use the word, their area of work with, there seemed to be a very intense focus on very large goals, very large goals, and with the focus seemed to be on, doing high quality work for long periods of time and how to get there. And I did hear a lot of distress from some of them about how their own colleagues may not sometimes be actually delivering this. And there was a lot of intense emotions around that I felt when they talked about it. And they also talked about how to remedy this situation. So it's not uncommon for any say teachers such as me, who's in a teaching profession alongside my clinical work, to sometimes feel how do we improve the quality of training and to see how people actually go back to the community and do what is expected of them. I think a lot of that came through in the presentation. Just to kind of bring the focus onto India, in India, a lot of professionals who go into early interventions or trying to work with teenagers and adults, many of them are actually, they probably have got some kind of postgraduate degrees often, and they are probably also, they have been taught a kind of textbook stuff which kind of generalizes and gives a lot of information about various kinds of treatments going on, but a kind of intense focus on one school of thought, such as, let's say, behavioral intervention or teach model. It may not necessarily be happening with the same intensity if one were to be undergoing those kind of specific courses there. I think it's very useful to keep that in mind when you do give the answers. Many times professionals then subsequently ask their work, depending on what they're interested. Some of them manage to go overseas and get some training in those specific areas, probably for short periods of time, and some of them attend workshops and trainees and reflect on it. They have not had the advantage, like Kathleen was saying about, we need to not only know, but you need to see that they actually know how and they can actually show how. We need to model, and they probably not received all that kind of training. And a whole lot of professionals learn a lot on the job, and that's the scene. And in the process, in India, a lot of therapeutic work, eclecticism, I feel it's almost an accidental philosophy. And I'm saying this specifically because each one of you is bringing one specific focus on a specific area of work. And you will have to keep this in mind that most people in the audience are more used to thinking very eclectically. I think, having said that, I'll probably go in the same sequence that we had the presentations. In a very proud and very enthusiastic talk, it was lovely to hear from Sarah Butcher and Sue Piper about the intense work. If I heard right, you said 95 residents, 600 staff. At any one point in time, how many staff would be there on the campus? I got a lot of follow-up questions, but just if you can tell me, at any one point, because I guess they're all in shifts, right? 600 staff would be on shifts, I guess.
Yeah, so we have about 370 residential staff working a rotation of earlies and lates and nights. So we have 24-hour waking coverage for all our young people. So probably on any one shift, there'd be around maybe 100 and 180, and then there'll be all the school staff. And we have therapeutic staff, nursing staff.
It's a very high quality work environment, and there are 95 adults with such almost 3 to 4 times that number of staff there. I heard really give up, liked your sentences like do not give up, and that really touched a chord really. And you brought up the theme of the culture of autism. Anyone wanting to develop centers where a lot of people with these difficulties are living together, you brought the idea of culture of autism. So now I would like to really ask you, who funds this center? If supposing each family member has to pay for that particular kind of intervention, what would be the average person's cost? You said they may stay for a year or longer. So what would be the kind of cost that one is looking at? It could be paid by the government, it could be paid by the family, but if supposing a person is to be costed, how much would that come to?
Yeah. Well, it is working. So the cost for an individual who has an intense, staffing ratio of 1-to-1 and say one member of staff, one member of staff to 3 young people at night, you're looking at about, in English money, is £200,000 a year. That includes absolutely everything, because you can imagine. The way that it's paid for is through our services, so it's the local authority services, so it's government funded. It comes in tri-funding in some ways. There's education's contribution. Every young person's entitled to an education, be it whatever school. Social services pay a part of that as well. And for those who have the very complex needs, such as the health needs, there's also a contribution, so that's made up tri-funding. It would be very rare for it to be private funded, to be honest.
Right. So it's 200,000 into 95.
Per year, per young person.
Into 95 per year. I mean, that's, you said per person cost per year would be about £200,000.
Yeah, and that's, I'm trying to give a sort of average. We've got young people who are deaf, we've got very few who are day pupils, and then we've got some young people who require extra staffing.
Right, okay. I mean, it definitely sounds daunting. I mean, but I can understand. I mean, it's a key message is, you need high quality inputs, you pay for it, and you find the money.
Yeah,
and you need to raise the money.
I mean, I want to say, unfortunately, they've been turned away from everywhere else. Nowhere else will work with the young people. So we have to make a difference, and somebody has to do that. We've often been told that actually, if it wasn't your school, they'll be hospitalised, and that will cost more. And they possibly won't come back out, whereas actually we can make a difference. And I mean, I was having a great conversation last night, and we were talking about, I wish people would start looking at the long-term cost of a young person instead of firefighting and saying, I won't pay that. Well, actually, if you pay that now and we do some intense work, I mean, we work up to 25, it's not just early intervention, what will be the cost later? I would hope less.
Thank you for that. I take the message that, we need to probably think of raising money from community sources to manage these kind of centers. I mean, and I keep telling people that a sign of civilized society is how well they take care of the vulnerable. And, to looking at long-term costs and making sure so much goes into it, I think the community may have to support a lot when it comes to these kind of interventions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really important that I just point out we work as a charity, we're not a business, so any money that comes in through what the organisation pays goes absolutely into growth of the organisation. Okay, it's not a business model, it's not profit making.
Right. Thank you. Right. In a very erudite and sober presentation, Dr. Ukang, I mean, I'm using that word sober because you're the only person who did not overtly demonstrate the emotions that all other presenters brought in. My apologies, but I must say it's a very erudite and sober presentation. Dr. Ukang brought about the challenges of working with complex behaviors. I mean, it would be the kind of behaviors which I'm sure even the Priory Center would also be working on. Yeah, I would like to know from you, what would be, say, a 15-year-old with 1 or 2 years of intensive self-injurious behaviors? Okay, what would be an average duration of intervention, following the methods that you so well described?
Sure. Can you guys hear? Okay. So first of all, I guess sober presentation is a compliment?
Compliment. It's a compliment because I want to point out something. Because all persons who so passionately defended the BCBA, I mean, all of you are highly qualified and you come from probably academic centers or you're into training, and that could make a big difference between people who have just had a single bachelor's degree and are working, because very often many Indian centers tend to see persons who have had lesser training, and and their nature of work, sometimes you're not very sure. You pass judgments on the ABA method because they may not have been well trained, and they may be actually struggling to actually do a good job too. But I could sense the difference when people are highly trained, very much into researching it. I mean, it's good to hear from you all. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So the question was, a 15-year-old individual, how long would treatment take if they engage in very severe problem behaviors? And to be honest, that's a very difficult question to answer, because I think many of us talked about the highly individualized nature of intervention for all of the individuals, or for all the folks with ASD. And that also applies to how effective and how quickly intervention will actually become effective. And so, parents ask me that all the time. The insurance companies, when I used to work with them, used to ask me that. And my response was, it really depends on that particular individual. So some children or some individuals might respond to treatment very, very quickly, and others might be much more resistant to treatment, so it might take much, much longer. But I think using an evidence-based approach like ABA, we rely upon the data that we collect to guide as to when we've determined treatment is effective there.
Right.
So the simple answer is it depends.
It depends, yeah. Right. And yeah, there's another point that occurred to me. It's not coming right now. Yeah, I wanted to know what fraction of the persons that you would be training so intensely would probably also be on medications. Is that possible, or that's absolutely no?
Well, in all likelihood, most of the kids, particularly those kids who engage in these problem behaviors, I would estimate that 100% probably come in with at least one psychotropic medication.
Would be continuing even during the intervention.
Yeah, in all likelihood, they've gone through many different medications. And so, for example, I've worked with a 5-year-old child who came in on Haldol, which is a very powerful psychotropic medication there, and it had very little, if any, effect on the behaviors there. So you see that as really, that tends to be, I think, one of the first lines of intervention, at least in the U.S.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We heard from Liliana Ruta. I'm a child psychiatrist myself, but it's not very often that I'm actually carrying out the interventions. I have the luxury of having other people help me out on that, but I could see that your personal interest in actually carrying out these interventions. So you did mention something very important which is important from Indian point of view. You brought about the issue of parent coaching. Like I just mentioned, the issue of cost. I mean, this is something which drives everything that happens or does not happen in India. And more often than not, professionals tend to conclude, and government tends to think, that parent coaching should be the real way forward. And I heard also arguments about not to burden parents, and parents should be parents and not therapists. I take that point. But India is at this point in time probably more often thinking that we can't do without parents as far as spreading otherwise the cost can be extremely difficult for most families to meet. So I wanted to know from you, you are pretty sure that it has a very positive loop with that, and it's kind of working out extremely well. So if you can share that little more, because a lot of people who work here would like to work with parents. And I would also like to know from you, the ESDM model that you described will be going hand in hand with a lot of other interventions for them with regard to self-help and other things that will be going on. That will be an independent set of interventions in the community, and this will be added on top of that.
Well, so the first point about the parent coaching, I think all the research on intervention the last 10 years has moved from one-to-one intervention done in neutral setting towards intervention that can really be effective and being generalized into the daily life of families and children, and to test the efficacy of parent-mediated intervention. So it's not specific for the ESDM, but many other interventions now incorporate the active participation of the parents. The way you have to think about the parent-mediated intervention is not a way where the therapist has, again, I mentioned before, gives the parent a further burden. It's not that you say, you know, this is your problem, you have to deal with that. Because the lack of putting the parents away, the lack of services, the lack of being together around a table to reflect about her behavior, your child needs, what is your set of priorities. Let's work on your priorities instead of my priorities or my program priorities. It actually really welcome the needs, the anxiety, or the background of the parents. So the point is that, you know, this is your child, and that's you. I can help you to learn why does this, what you can do, how to interact, how to spend time with him in a way that is very much satisfying for you and for him. And in this process, you have the unique opportunity to create, you know, a tremendous amount of learning opportunities for the child that you never talk with the parents in terms of you are doing an ABC, you are reinforcing this. Basically, you do a sort of spiral where you understand the starting point of the parent, and you give them that seed that they need to have an interaction with the child, to promote the right behaviors and to extinguish the behaviors that are not appropriate. And it works very well. The more you work with the family every single week, and they generalize at home, and you have feedback.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
And this ESDM happens over and above
So
other general...
So when we test the ESDM, basically it's developmental and behavioral models that comprehends all the domains of development. Is meant to be implemented in a multidisciplinary team. So children who undergo an ESDM program, actually they work on all the domains of development. So they work on receptive language, expressive language, fine and gross motor skills, social skills, cognition, self-help skills. So it's very comprehensive global model for early intervention.
Thank you. Dr. Leaf, I mean, I think your lawyer training you said you started off in your mind with, I mean, the passionate argument, you seem to be really a great defense lawyer for ABA. I mean, it's really nice to hear your presentation. And I liked your plea that we need to move from ivory tower models to practical models. I mean, that was really it's a great message, actually. And you also brought in an issue which was, I think, very, very relevant for a clinician like me. You said we need to bring in the clinical judgment to everything that's being done. I know there's more than one point of view on that, but you brought up that issue. Thank you for that. Now, you did say that the training is a big issue. And I know with, like IAC has plans to actually see if we can get some kind of a training system put in place so the adequate amount of staff available for all the future needs that's being thought about. So what would you say? I mean, a graduate degree in ABA would be insufficient, or do you think there needs to be a qualitative change in the way this training happens, or they need a much longer period of training with a lot of interning and supervision? Because it's an important thing for us, because the IAC would probably want to learn from this and think about how to actually have good, trained, qualified staff.
First of all, I hope I'm a defender of quality ABA, because
Yes.
I'm not a defender of ABA.
Okay.
I think most ABA is quite poor, but it's quality ABA. We had a wonderful presentation after me about training. I think what you talked about is what I think great training is, and I think it's two prongs. Having knowledge is important, facts, but it's performance-based, and I think it's providing training that is performance-based. I think the other aspect is clinical judgment takes training. It's why, you just aren't letting them make any decision. They have to have considerations. When are they doing this versus that? And that takes training to occur. And so it's just, again, we're not time-based. I can't give you a time how long that takes. It takes what it takes. But I certainly know it's more than 1 or 2 weeks to get to that point.
Right. Point taken, because that's the thing that when Kathleen brought the issue of even the clinical judgment bit needs to be actually trained, so broken down. And if I can just switch between you and Kathleen on this topic, I mean, would you be insistent that this training has to be highly manualized and the person has to have some kind of a continued training program, like it happens in continued medical education? So they need to not only follow the manual, but regularly have upgradation, recertification based on their fidelity to the manuals.
I believe that ongoing training has to occur regularly. For anybody who's actually working with human services specifically in a fragile population that we have, we end up calling it supervision long term, but supervision is in fact just repeated training, repeated feedback, repeated reinforcement over and over again. And I agree with Dr. Leaf. Our best programs are center-based programs because I can have that impact on a regular basis, interacting with individuals repeatedly. So I think training has to happen regularly. It never stops. We never stop learning. We never stop getting better. And the clinical pathways or the clinical judgments, they change rapidly. Behavior is predictable under certain respects, but I mean, a 2-year-old working with a 2-year-old, you're going to see their behavior affect your behavior, and it's going to constantly change and shift and morph. And you need to be trained on, what do I do now? And I think the parents getting that type of training, what do I do now? How do I interact with my child? It's not simply just training on how to apply certain principles. It's sometimes training on how to just interact and have a relationship. That needs to occur repeatedly over time. The idea of manualizing things, I am a big fan, and maybe a little bit different than Dr. Leaf. I do think we need to have standard operating procedures, and I do think that because of the explosion and just continuity of care, I do think that you need the standardized manual. Having said that, the supervision on top of that, it makes it the most important.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I wouldn't suggest there should be standard models, operating models. It's training within that. How do you deviate from that, and what the considerations are to deviate. And within that model, you have the full range. So again, I think unfortunately, what I see too often, there's only one way to do it. So you look at a prompting strategy, you are an errorless prompter, or you are wrong prompter, or and it's like, well, sometimes you are that, sometimes you're this, and these are the considerations where you move from that. So I'm all in for manuals, as long as there's flexibility and understanding how to use those manuals. That's what I'm looking for. I think some of it comes down to training about how to be analytic, being a critical thinker. And regardless, I think critical thinking in the United States has gone away in every aspect of what we do in the United States, I think. We need to train our staff to be critical thinkers. We need to train everyone to be critical thinkers. You take a situation, you analyze it, and why is it happening now? It's why when our kids come into the clinic, or I'm working in schools, teachers need to ask right away, how did he sleep last night? Did he have a good meal? How's he feeling? Because that's going to change what we do. And it's then evaluating second by second, should we do it this way or that way? And again, I think unfortunately, people aren't trained to do that. They're trained to, I go to too many places where there's absolutely set protocols. Even that what you say is there before you even sit down with a child, and you don't deviate from that. You don't deviate from what you're asking them to do. There's no deviation. And again, it makes it easy, but it doesn't provide quality services. And it's how to train people to be able to make those considerations.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Leaf. Dr. Manente, again, you continued with the whole panel's passionate account. I loved your proud defense of the landscape in your institution and how the center is going to be set amidst teachers, students, and postdocs, and so on. You have a K21 model. Like many people were mentioning in the model, the best that one can probably find in India today would be K16 model, and very often after 15, 16 years of age, they're not sure where they would go. But if you can keep the focus on K16 period, where do you think the adult needs should start getting tailored in and into the programs so that the proportions are gradually enhanced from that period with the focus on adult needs rather than focusing on the K to 16 period needs? Where do you think these things need to be factored in? Because that's a key question for a lot of centers in India as to when should they start moving from the K16 needs to the adult side. Yeah.
In kindergarten.
Okay.
So you should focus on thinking about adulthood in kindergarten. And so I think one of the biggest problems, and this is global again, not just in the US, parents, families, individuals end up getting surprised by the onset of adulthood, right? And I'm not saying, in kindergarten, start working on vocational tasks. No, but parents and individuals, family members and loved ones need to start having some urgency and outrage and advocacy and thought processes about what's coming in adulthood from the very start. So again, a lot of times in the school age programming, things aren't perfect, right? And that's an understatement. Even in the US, in the best of private schools and the best public school districts, things are rarely ever perfect. So often parents and teachers get consumed with the day-to-day, and that's part of why, what's going to come 3, 5, 10 years from now doesn't get addressed till it's right on the horizon, and by then it's far too late.
Right. So, I mean, all of us working and directly working with parents very early, and with the constant focus on academic training that comes more often in India. I suppose it's in many places too. But though you're suggesting right from young, tell the parents to think about the future. And I think that's a very important message for
people with autism have similar lifespans of any other people,
Right.
okay? So people are adults far longer than their children, all right? So we should be thinking about adulthood as our ultimate outcome from the very start.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just spread these things around. We just choose one of them to answer. Especially here from the Vermont and the stuff. So, I mean, since you all have gone through it, yeah, you could, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, can you please elaborate the multidisciplinary team of early intervention model so that parents of new diagnosed kids can have better idea on about the team? Yeah. So, one of the aspects of the ESDM is clearly the fact that, as I said, it's a comprehensive model that works on the different areas of development of the child. The important aspect is that no one professional works alone. So the idea is that the needs and the expertise that you need as a basis to work on a sophisticated methods like the ESDM, like the ABA, is such that you really want to incorporate the knowledge and the expertise of the different professionalities. So in a multidisciplinary team where, for example, in our staff and in staff that work on the SDM, you will have the pediatrician, you will have the child psychiatrist, you will have the speech and language therapist. In terms of the staff that works with the child, you will have the psychomotor therapist, you will have the OT, because each of them work, there's a team leader who will develop together with the other professionals the objective plans for the child that has been revised every 3 months with a task analysis, and all together discuss the case. And then it's very likely that more than one professional sharing the same methodologies, the same objectives, will work and will get inputs on how to work on the different aspects.
Okay, thank you. So, big team.
The question is, what are your suggestions when dealing with staff who do not take corrective feedback well? That's a great question. And it happens very, very frequently. What we've done that I've found success over 50% of the time is letting people know early on that feedback is in fact a gift, that it becomes part of the culture. And what that means is it's also a reciprocal, it's reciprocal. You give me feedback as the supervisor, I ask for that feedback, I take the corrective feedback, and then it becomes part of routine. It becomes part of how to consistently do the same thing over and over again But having said that, it's hard. You know, people get their feelings hurt, and we try. There has never been a time where I've worked with a teacher, a therapist, any student at all who didn't want to do well. Everybody who gets into this field, especially human services, is intrinsically motivated to do well. We love what we do. We love getting the reinforcement, working with the child. So when you get the corrective feedback, it stings. It stings a lot. Even still to this day, I have to, do my hard swallow and kind of plot forward. But that's where that 80% makes a difference. It should be that I approach you and you're thinking she's going to say something nice, and you do say something nice, and maybe, some people disagree with this, but I sandwich it. I give you the hey, did really good on this. Maybe you want to try something different here. Kind, caring, and then follow it up with, I like how you're really working very well. So it's positive with a kind, caring, gentle feedback, and then followed up with another positive to try and give it really more like somebody's craving that.
Right.
Once you get it into that culture, once it becomes habit and routine, that's when it's easier and it stings a little bit less. But I've been doing this for 20 years and it still hurts a little.
Thank you. So all supervisors need to learn to speak euphemistically. Thank you. Yeah, it's that.
So the question is, what are your priorities when dealing with older learners who never had any intervention? And so I actually just want to add to the question also. Sometimes the learners who come to us have had intervention, but the intervention has focused on skills that aren't meaningful or functional. Right, so on many occasions, I've had adults with autism who could tell me what the weather's like outside, who can, use a calendar, who can write in cursive perfectly, but can't use the bathroom independently. Right? So it's not just a lack of treatment, but sometimes we get treatment that hasn't really focused on the most important adaptive skills. But so we really we have running lists of things that people ought to be able to do in order to be independent, in order to lead healthy lives. But as far as a starting point, that would be highly individualized and really should be determined by systematic evaluation. Right? So anytime we get a new learner, we do comprehensive evaluation across multiple domains of functioning, including cognitive functioning, behavioral functioning, vocational functioning, and there are a number of different assessment tools that are readily available that people can use for that. We also do direct evaluation of individuals' performance across contexts within a variety of environments, center, home, school. Obviously, if someone's coming to you and presenting with some really severe challenging behavior that represents an imminent threat to their life, that's probably a good starting point, right? But separate of that, very specific situation, really the individual should drive where intervention should begin.
Thank you. Sue and Sarah, I think, go on, yes.
So I've received a couple similar questions. So how to control a child who knows they will get attention if they hurt themselves. So I think that's a good starting point, is that I guess the reason or the cause of the behavior. In this particular example would be attention. And Temple Grandin this morning mentioned a strategy that we'll use very frequently to try to avoid these behaviors from occurring in the first place, which is to really help develop communication. So if the child has been hitting themselves because they've received attention in the past, then one of the more common strategies would be to teach the child a more appropriate and alternative means of seeking out that attention. So it could be verbally asking for attention by saying, excuse me, or hey mom, hi dad. Or if the person is nonverbal, it could be using a picture exchange card, or perhaps something as simple as raising their hand if it's a lower functioning individual there. I think the other part of it is, we're developing strategies for replacing the problematic behavior, but we also want to make sure that people aren't continuing to provide attention for the self-injurious behavior there. And so oftentimes I'll hear from teachers in particular, they'll say, well, I have to tell him not to do that, otherwise he won't learn that it's not something that he or she should be doing. Well, my point to the teachers is always, well, you've been telling them not to do that. Has that changed their behavior? Has that stopped them from engaging in SIB? And the teachers will in most cases recognize that no, it hasn't. So give it a try. Don't give them attention. It doesn't mean that you can't block or protect the child, but you don't need to have a long discussion about why hitting themselves is not a good thing to do.
Thank you. Time permitting, we'll come around for one more. I know there are quite a few questions for each, so we'll just take one at a time. Yeah, sure, sir. Sure. You can take. Yeah, you can take one of them. Yeah.
In Teach, do you suggest the pictures of the child's daily schedule be put up at home by their parents too? And what if it's not feasible to do this by the parents? So again, you work with parents. Everybody wants something different. There's some very natural routines that go on at home, which, just getting ready for bed. There's a bed routine, and you don't want to interfere with what naturally goes on. But we find a lot of our parents do ask us for help. They ask us for support, especially over a weekend, when they might need to go out in the car, go shopping, go to the swimming pool. And it might not be to the same intensity that we offer a schedule within our school, our learning environment, but actually just telling a young person we're doing this first and then we're going to do this. So it might be a less favoured item, going to the shops because they don't like going around the supermarket, but followed by then we're going to go to the cafe because you like the cafe, would be very useful information to share with a young person. So it's about knowing what the family need, what the family want, and what's right for the young person. If there's a lot of problems at home, I'd be suggesting that a schedule will help with that unpredictability. But like I said, there's some very good natural routines that go on at home, as for any of us, bedtime routines, etc. And you don't necessarily need to interfere with those because parents have a tough enough job, as we've all said. But if it helps, then absolutely. But as care providers, as educators, it's something that we would provide and help our parents with.
Okay, thank you. So choose the battles that you want to pick on, and need not necessarily be the same type for everyone. So it's led by parents and their expressed needs. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Mine.
Dr. Leaf.
There's time to leave my glasses at the hotel, so I'll use a flashlight. The Life magazine photography was a manifestation of the tough love ethics of the 60s. What was said about it was entirely consistent with your important message about non-rigid, child-centered ABA. Are we on the same page? Do you agree? Yes, I agree with most of it. Let me give you a little clarification, though. The tough love was not really a 60s thing. I grew up in the 60s, and it was pretty, I didn't experience tough love, and neither did any of my friends, or maybe it's because I was in Southern California, so we were all, non-contingently loved, etc. Why they used punishment procedures in the 60s was based upon research. Again, it was the pioneering days. Evar was working with kids that were really literally killing themselves. I remember we have a film of biting their finger off, a child biting his finger off, detached retinas, just that kind of work. He actually started, and interesting enough, Evar was psychoanalytically trained. He was not a behaviorist, he was a psychoanalyst at the University of Washington. And he trained that way. And so when he had kids with autism, it was actually called self-destructive behavior. And why it was called self-destructive behavior? Because they were destroying their ego. And that's how he viewed it. So he gave them non-contingent admiration when he was starting treatment. But he took data on that, because he's also had an influence by Baer and Wolf and Risley and Bijou take data. He took data and he saw when he gave contingent affection and love, when they hit themselves, they actually got worse. And so he thought, maybe this is what they were telling me about. This could be operant behavior. And so maybe providing attention, supports isn't the right thing. And so then he started looking at what the opposite was and doing punishment procedures. And the reason he used strong punishment procedures is he was working at a state institution and they needed to quantify the degree of punishment. And that's where it started. So it wasn't really a tough love kind of thing. It was really research-based why he went to that. Over the years, he saw and we saw we could accomplish that without using punishment procedures. We had to be more creative, and we were out of the pioneering days. So there was an evolution of what we did over time, where we got into functional analysis and teaching replacement skills whatsoever. I think the interesting thing, I've got, again, another film I love showing when I've got the time, is showing the 60s And people would be shocked at the things they were doing. They were doing observational learning. They were doing group work. They were doing inclusion. They were using natural language. Things that often today aren't being used was being done in the 60s. So it was really an innovative project. So I agree with everything else that was said on this question, other than it wasn't really because of tough love. That's not why EVAR was doing it.
Thank you, thank you. I can't cite Chandrika. I mean, do we have another 10 minutes? Can they take it? 5 minutes, okay. Quick, any one of the other questions that you've had a chance to look at? Yeah.
I will go very quickly on this one. Some tips for caretakers, parents, or teachers burnout. Well, I think this is a very important point because working in difficult situations, of course, causes to each of us, other parents, professionals, to teachers, all around some fragilities or difficulties cause distress that is acute and is chronic and goes on. I think that one of the messages I would give is frustrations are present, of course. Moments where there are no progresses are there, where we don't understand really. But the more we set objectives and goals that are shared, that are relevant to the needs of the child, to the priorities of the parents, to when we set the right goals for that child, for that windows of his development, then it's much more likely that we are looking at the right small objectives and we are not getting the frustration of not reaching those objectives. That's the first point. The second point is that if we are happy while doing things, then if the child is motivated, if the child is happy, if we are following his motivation and interests, then that's the best framework to create really a better situation not to get a burnout.
Thank you, thank you. Maybe half a minute, each of you can give your views so we can.
One of these, how to overcome behaviors of kids varying with person to person. So I take that to mean, the child behaves differently in the presence of other therapists, which happens very, very frequently. The answer to that is actually more analysis. We have to attend to why and look at the variables associated with. Typically what I see is reinforcement is occurring and the staff don't realize it, meaning the one staff is attending to one behavior repeatedly or on a variable schedule, and that's when systematic training and intervention needs to occur.
So I actually just want to address a couple of themes that came up a few times, and one is cost, right? So for those of us that are running very high quality programs, there's been some concern over what those costs are and whether, in India in particular, there could be the resources to do this. And what I want to say in response to that is India is already paying the cost of not having those high quality services. So you need to quantify those costs in lost wages, for parents and family members, in poor psychological and physical health outcomes, and the corresponding treatment that comes from that, of being treated in emergency rooms, lost value from individuals that don't have the opportunity to contribute to the community. And from what I understand, there's a huge population of families and individuals with autism in India who generally don't leave their house, right? Because there's an incredible stigma, and parents are and loved ones are fearful of what might happen if they bring their loved ones with autism out into the community. So that's an enormous cost that India is already bearing, and I think you should focus on quantifying that. And so just to take a left turn, I also want to just quickly focus on training, and everyone keeps asking, well, what level of training, what degree do you need? And this is always bittersweet when I say this out loud, because becoming a BCBA is very rigorous. It does take a great amount of didactic, academic coursework and hands-on practicum, but someone who gets their BCBA is minimally qualified to practice, okay? So just because someone has a BCBA does not mean that they're an expert, does not mean that they're a specialist. It means that their journey has just begun, okay? So someone who's just gotten their BCBA is not necessarily an expert.
Thank you for the perspective, yeah. a minute.
Okay. Here's, I think, a relatively quick answer. So who's the right person to assess a child for autism? Is it a doctor, psychologist, OT? And so I think it shouldn't be just one person or one discipline. Best practice would dictate that it should really be a multidisciplinary approach. So there is a physician and a psychologist and an occupational therapist and speech pathologist, so that each of those people from the different disciplines can bring in their expertise to determine whether or not the individual has autism.
This one says, after living in such a structured environment, how do the young adults regulate themselves in the real world? So that's a really interesting question for me. Coming to India, it's very much a real world, and what I was doing was looking for signs and symbols that I would recognize to tell me where the bathroom was and where I could eat. So the real world is a visual world. And one of the things that we talked about earlier was about making the structure more discreet, more portable. I have a nephew who's 31 years old. He has high-functioning autism. When he was little, he had one of these lovely big schedules that we showed earlier. Now he has an iPhone, and he has his schedule on his iPhone, and he has little sort of social reminders on his iPhone. So if he gets into a little pickle, he can look up and think, okay, where have I had this before? A little bit like Temple Grandin, when he is experiencing something, we give him a way out, we give him a little script maybe to use, and he can just look on his iPhone like any other young adult. So structure doesn't go away, and our young adults who leave us and graduate take their structure with them. That might be overt, it might be objects of reference, because that makes them function at an independent level. But the real world needs to adapt, and we need to take structure with us into the real world. And actually, when you travel around the world, you find out the world is a very visual place, and thank God it is, because I don't speak Indian. So I'm really happy that we can still see that visual information that really helps young people with autism live in our world.
Thank you.
Just a comment about the cost of treatment over the lifespan. There's been 2 studies that have been done. Jim Mulek did one earlier on. There's one later on that's been done. I think it's $3 to $6 million in the lifespan of a son with autism. So that study's there. My question was, what do you do with a child that's 5 years old, nonverbal, and highly aggressive about language? For me, it starts with needing to deal with disruptive behaviors. I can't teach skills if I've got aggressive behaviors, if I have a child that doesn't listen. So we have to first deal with the disruptive, challenging behaviors. Secondly, we deal with what we call learning how to learn skills. We need to teach our students how to learn. And that's individualized, of course, but sometimes it's paying attention, sometimes it's joint attention, sometimes it's teaching them how to wait, sometimes it's how to process information. So we have to look at our learners, and this regardless of age, and say, how do they know, what learning deficits do they have so they can't learn effectively? And we have to teach those skills. Once we have those going, then we're going to be dealing simultaneously with communication, socialization, play, recreation, everything the child needs or adolescent or adult needs.
Thank you. Thank you all for a wonderful panel discussion, and thank you all for your attention. Over to Chandrika.
Thank you, Dr. M.V. Ashok, for chairing this passion-driven panel discussion, and Dr. Mininte, Dr. Stengel, Dr. Ruta, Dr. Kang, Dr. Leaf, and Sue and Sarah for being a part of it. With this, it's a wrap for day 2 of the conference. Thank you, audience, for all your patience. Thank you to all our speakers for entertaining us with their knowledge, skill, and expertise. We'll see everyone tomorrow for the final day of the conference at 9 a.m. sharp. Please don't forget to check out our social media handles, and don't forget to carry your ID cards. Please have a great evening ahead. Thank you.